Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey, Herman and Corn. So one of the things I like about this podcast is that I don't spend my life buying tech gear. I kind of wish I did. I probably would have been pretty good as a business buyer, although I guess then you have to buy stuff for other people. Less fun. But what I do sometimes is I use you guys to do some purchasing research because I'm a very discriminating kind of tech consumer. I really like to do my research before I pick up something. And that's why I love using AI for this, because I would say my batting average of successful tech purchases has been pretty close to 100% since using AI to say, this is exactly what I need, what's good. And if it means taking a bit more time to find a really quality product, it's almost always worth it. I'm hoping my new monitor stands, which I'm looking at now, fall into that category. So what I do in practice, and for anyone else who loves tech but lives on a budget, like probably 99% of tech fans who haven't had a multi-million startup exit, although I wouldn't say no to one at the moment. But I create these kind of shortlists, and I kind of like to plan out, okay, in a few months, this is something I'll be able to afford. I'm going to work towards it. And I found it a great way to avoid impulse purchasing, because you kind of have a system for deferring and slotting it into a priority system. When you have budget, you go for it. So this is one of those things. We should actually probably talk about that system in another episode, because I think I'm just kind of hacking at a basic implementation. I'm sure there's much better ways to do it. But what I'd love to talk about, one of the things on my system that I think actually should be bumped up in triage because it's important, is an Android tablet for the car. So my wife and I drive a 2012 Seat Ibiza. I barely drive. I hate driving in Israel. It's super stressful. But my wife does it every few days for business. And this thing is like, we have a good car mechanic, and I think he just kind of slotted it in. And it's super slow. So I was taking a look at it the other day, seeing what's actually in there. I pulled it out from the dash, and it's cable management. Oh my gosh, it looked like a hornet's nest in there. I've never seen something so I was super messy, but it's like a gigabyte of RAM, and when you're trying to do navigation, I was surprised the thing would even work. Now, what I want to ask you about Herman and Corn is, for these head units, I assume, looking at it, it's like one of these generic Chinese things. And I mentioned the year of our car because I'm not sure, for those who have older vehicles still on the road, if that's a constraint in terms of the actual connectors. What I want to talk about is actually a little bit more specific in the search for a tablet head unit, because what I keep thinking from building my own desktop and learning a bit more about the importance of cooling is, how on earth are these things able to withstand the heat we have here in Israel? When you jump into a car in the summer, if it's been sitting in a parking space for a bit of time, it is an inferno. I don't know what the internal temperature clocks in at, but when you turn on the ignition and run the aircon for a few minutes, it starts to cool. But the internal components must be really, really hot. So what I'm wondering is, if I were to guess what we would need to look for in a non-crappy tablet that's actually going to, give us decent performance. And by decent, I just mean that when we turn on the ignition and we say we want to go here, there's no waiting for Waze to start or Waze freezing, all these things that I think we're experiencing. Obviously, we need a much better spec than 1 gigabyte RAM. That's for sure. But looking for a head unit that will perform well in a hot country, I imagine that CPU and cooling must be a very important, if not the most important thing to be looking for. So Herman and Corn, elementary question is, how on earth does it do it? For manufacturers of head units, If we think about where they're being mounted into, it's a very enclosed space. And secondly, reputable brands and reputable CPUs. If you don't have the luxury of being able to identify specific brands, if maybe you do have to look at these generic AliExpress units for your budget, if you can at least make an informed decision about the CPU and the components, what would you be looking for to make sure that you're buying a processor and hardware in it that's actually going to be able to perform well, even under these demanding conditions. Herman and Corn, over to the two of you.
Hey everyone, welcome back to my Weird Prompts. I am Corn, and I'm joined as always by my brother, the man who probably knows more about the internal temperature of a dashboard than is strictly healthy. How are you doing today, Herman?
Herman Poppleberry, at your service. And you are not wrong, Corn. I have spent more time than I care to admit looking at thermal throttling graphs for small enclosed electronics. It is a fascinating, if somewhat sweaty, corner of the tech world. I actually spent my weekend testing the heat dissipation of different types of electrical tape. It was riveting.
I bet it was. You really know how to live it up on a Saturday night. But seriously, we have a great prompt today from our housemate Daniel. He was telling us about the struggle with the head unit in his 2012 Seat Ibiza. If you have ever lived in a place like Jerusalem in the summer, you know that a car parked in the sun is not just a vehicle. It is an oven. It is a hostile environment for silicon.
It is literally a solar cooker, Corn. We are talking internal temperatures that can easily hit 70 degrees Celsius, or about 160 degrees Fahrenheit on the dashboard surface, and that is just the ambient air. If the sun is hitting that screen directly, the internal components can climb even higher. Daniel is looking to upgrade from what sounds like a pretty sluggish 1 GB RAM unit to something that actually works. He wants to know about heat, reputable brands, and what specs to look for when you are on a budget in 2026.
Right, because the market for these Android head units is basically the Wild West. You go on AliExpress or even Amazon, and you see 1,000 different brands that all look identical, but the price ranges from $80 to $500. It is incredibly confusing for a consumer. You see these flashy interfaces and promises of high-speed performance, but then you read the reviews, and people are talking about units melting or freezing up after 10 minutes of driving.
It really is a minefield. And Daniel's point about the 1 GB of RAM is the perfect place to start. That is the single biggest trap in the car audio world right now. People see a cheap price tag, they see the word Android, and they think it will work like their phone. But a 1 GB RAM unit in 2026 is essentially a paperweight that happens to play radio. Android 14, which is what most modern units should be aiming for, simply cannot breathe in that little space. It is like trying to run a marathon while breathing through a cocktail straw.
Well, let us dig into the hardware first then. If someone is looking at these units specifically with heat in mind, what is the heart of the machine? What kind of CPUs are we actually seeing in these things as of February 2026?
So, in the world of what enthusiasts call Chinese head units, or CHS, there is a clear hierarchy. At the bottom, you have the old MediaTek chips, things like the MT8227L. These are ancient. They are quad-core, they are slow, and they produce a surprising amount of heat for how little work they do because they are built on an old, inefficient manufacturing process. You want to avoid those at all costs. They are the reason people think Android head units are garbage.
Okay, so avoid the bottom-tier MediaTek. What is the gold standard right now?
Currently, the king of the budget-to-performance ratio is the Unisoc UIS 7862, but since we are in 2026, the real star is the UIS 7870. Sometimes you will see the 7862 listed as the FYT platform. The 7870 is an octa-core chip built on a 6 nanometer process. That 6 nanometer number is the most important thing Daniel needs to look for.
Explain that for the non-engineers, Herman. Why does the nanometer size matter for a car in Jerusalem?
It is all about efficiency. Smaller nanometer processes generally mean the transistors are closer together and require less voltage to switch. Less voltage means less wasted energy, and wasted energy in electronics is always expressed as heat. A 6 nanometer chip like the UIS 7870 will perform significantly better while staying much cooler than an older 12 nanometer or 28 nanometer chip. It is the difference between a cool LED bulb and an old incandescent one that burns your fingers.
And that is the key, right? If it is efficient, it is not generating as much of its own heat while it is trying to navigate through traffic and stream music simultaneously. Because the unit is already fighting the sun, it shouldn't be fighting itself.
Exactly. There is also the Qualcomm Snapdragon 665, or the newer 685 units. These are becoming more common in high-end units. They are fantastic because they have excellent thermal management and very stable drivers for things like Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. If Daniel sees a unit with a Snapdragon 685 and at least 8 gigabytes of RAM, he is in the premium safe zone. But for a budget, that UIS 7870 is the sweet spot.
But performance is only half the battle. Daniel's big concern was the heat. He mentioned his unit is tucked into an enclosed space. In a 2012 Seat Ibiza, that head unit is right in the middle of the dash, surrounded by plastic and probably some air conditioning ducting, but not much airflow. It is basically a plastic tomb.
That is the real killer. Most of these units are passively cooled. They have a thin aluminum heatsink on the back, and that is it. In a normal climate, that might be fine. But in a hot climate, once that aluminum reaches the ambient temperature of the dashboard, which we said can be 70 degrees Celsius, it can't dissipate heat anymore. The CPU starts to throttle, which means it slows itself down to avoid melting. That is when the UI gets laggy, the music stutters, and eventually the unit might just reboot or shut down to protect itself.
So what is the solution for someone in a hot climate? Do you look for units with active cooling, or is there a way to move that heat out of the dash?
Absolutely look for active cooling. Some of the more reputable brands like Joying or Teyes have started including small cooling fans on the back of their higher-end units as a standard feature. It seems like a small thing, but moving even a tiny amount of air across those fins makes a massive difference. It breaks that pocket of stagnant hot air behind the dash. If you are buying a unit that doesn't have a fan, you can actually mod them yourself. People buy small 5-volt or 12-volt Noctua fans and zip tie them to the back, tapping into the amp turn-on wire for power.
That sounds like exactly the kind of thing you would do, Herman. I can see you now, upside down in the footwell with a soldering iron. But for someone like Daniel, who maybe just wants to buy something and have it work, are there specific brands that handle this better out of the box?
There are a few that have built a reputation for better build quality and actual engineering. Teyes is probably the biggest one right now. Their CC3 series, specifically the CC32K, is very popular because the software is stable and the hardware is robust. They actually have a pretty decent heatsink and a built-in fan that you can control via software. Joying is another good one. They use the Unisoc chips almost exclusively now, and their physical build quality is generally higher than the generic units. They use better capacitors that are rated for higher temperatures, which is a detail most people miss.
What about Atoto? I see them all over Amazon, and they seem to have a huge presence in the US and Europe.
Atoto is interesting because they are more of a global brand with actual customer service and localized warranties. Their S8 series is quite good. They tend to use different chipsets sometimes, but they are very honest about their specs. That is the biggest issue on AliExpress. You will see a unit advertised as having 8 gigabytes of RAM and Android 13, but when you actually get it, it is a spoofed version of Android 9 with 2 gigabytes of RAM.
Wait, they actually spoof the system settings? Like, the About Tablet section will just lie to you?
Oh, all the time. It is a huge problem. They modify the build properties file so the settings menu says whatever they want it to say. It is digital gaslighting. You have to run a third-party benchmarking tool like Device Info HW or AID A64 to see what is actually under the hood. This is why sticking to known brands like Teyes, Joying, or Dasaita is so important. You pay a $50 premium, but you actually get what you paid for. If a deal looks too good to be true on AliExpress, it is because you are buying a 2-nanometer lie.
That is a huge tip. So, for Daniel, if he is looking at his Seat Ibiza, he needs to look for a UIS 7870 chip, at least 4. But ideally 8 gigabytes of RAM, and a unit with a built-in fan. But let's talk about the display for a second. Does the screen type affect the heat? I know some of these screens get incredibly hot to the touch.
It does actually. Most budget units use traditional LCDs with a backlight. Those backlights generate heat, especially if you have the brightness cranked up to 100% because of the intense Jerusalem sun. Some newer high-end units are moving to QLED or even OLED. QLED is great because it is very bright but relatively efficient. But for a budget build, a good IPS screen is usually the sweet spot. It has better viewing angles than a cheap TN panel, which is vital when the unit is mounted in the dash of an Ibiza where it might be angled slightly away from the driver.
I want to go back to the installation for a second. Daniel mentioned the hornet's nest of cables behind his current unit. I have seen the back of these things, and it is a mess. You have the main harness, the RCA cables, the GPS antenna, the Wi-Fi antenna, the USB inputs, and sometimes an external mic. Does that clutter contribute to the heat problem?
It definitely doesn't help. If you have a massive bundle of wires shoved right against the heatsink of the head unit, you are essentially insulating it. You are wrapping your CPU in a plastic blanket. When Daniel installs his new one, he should really spend some time with zip ties and Teyes tape. Cable management isn't just about aesthetics, it is about airflow. In a cramped dash like the Ibiza, you want to clear as much space as possible behind the unit. I even recommend tucking the excess wire down into the lower part of the dash, away from the unit's rear chassis.
And what about the canvas decoder? For those who don't know, that is the little box that allows the head unit to talk to the car's computer for things like steering wheel controls or door opening alerts. Do those get hot?
Not usually. They are very low power, but they are another thing taking up space. One thing Daniel should look for is a unit that comes with a vehicle-specific harness. For a 2012 Seat Ibiza, he can get a kit that includes the plastic trim piece and a plug-and-play harness. It makes the installation much cleaner and reduces the amount of wire stripping and taping he has to do. The cleaner the install, the better the airflow.
Let's talk about the software side of the heat issue. Does the version of Android or the specific launcher you use impact how hard the processor has to work? I mean, if I am running a live wallpaper with a 3D car driving through a neon city, is that going to cook the chip?
Absolutely. A lot of these units come with very bloated, poorly optimized launchers that are trying to do too much. They have fancy 3D animations and weather widgets that are constantly pulling the GPS and the internet. If the unit is already struggling with the heat, that extra CPU and GPU load can push it over the thermal edge. It is like running a heavy video game on your phone while it is sitting on a radiator.
So, would you recommend a minimalist launcher? Something that doesn't look like a Michael Bay movie?
Definitely. Something like Agama Car Launcher or Car Web Guru. They are designed specifically for automotive use. They have big, easy-to-hit buttons, and they are very light on resources. Also, a big one for heat management is how you use navigation. If you are running Google Maps natively on the head unit, it is using the CPU, the GPU, and the GPS chip all at once. That generates a lot of internal heat.
Is that where something like phone mirroring comes in? Like wireless Android Auto or CarPlay? I use that in my car, and it seems way faster than the built-in apps.
Exactly. When you use Android Auto or CarPlay, the phone is doing all the heavy lifting. The head unit is basically just a dumb display and a touch interface. This significantly reduces the heat generated by the head unit's main processor. However, there is a catch. There is always a catch with you, Herman. What is it? Wireless CarPlay and Android Auto use a lot of Wi-Fi and Bluetooth bandwidth. The chips that handle that can get quite toasty. And if your phone is sitting in a wireless charging cradle while it is running Android Auto, your phone might overheat before the head unit does. In a hot climate, sometimes a good old-fashioned wired connection is actually the most reliable way to go. It keeps the phone charged without the massive heat of wireless charging, and it is more stable.
That is a great point. I have had my phone shut down because of heat just sitting on the passenger seat in the summer. If it is also trying to stream high-definition maps and music wirelessly, it is going to bake. So, wired connection for the win in the desert.
It really is. So, to recap the hardware specs for Daniel, UIS 7870 processor if possible, or a 7862 if the budget is tight. 8 GB of RAM is the new standard for 2026, but 4 is the absolute minimum. 64 GB of storage is fine, but look for UFS storage rather than eMMC if you can find it. It is faster and generates less heat during data transfers. And an IPS or QLED screen.
What about the budget? Daniel mentioned he is looking for something decent but on a budget. What is the realistic price point where you stop getting junk and start getting quality in today's market?
For a full kit, including the trim and the harness for an Ibiza, he is probably looking at $250 to $350. Anything under $200 is likely going to have one of those older chips or very little RAM, or it will be a Franken unit made of refurbished parts. It is a classic case of buy once, cry once. If he spends $90 on a cheap unit, he is going to be frustrated every single time he starts the car, and he will probably be replacing it by next summer.
And that frustration is real. Daniel mentioned how slow his current unit is. There is nothing worse than being in a hurry, jumping into a hot car, and having to wait 2 minutes for your navigation to even open while you are sweating through your shirt.
Oh, and that brings up another spec, boot time. Older or cheaper units do a cold boot every time you turn on the ignition. That can take 30 to 60 seconds. Better units have a sleep mode where they stay in a low power state for a few days. They boot up in about 2 seconds. For a daily driver, that is a massive quality of life improvement. You want a unit that supports fast boot or instant on.
Does that sleep mode drain the car battery? I know Daniel sometimes leaves his car for a few days without driving.
Very minimally. We are talking about the same amount of power your car's clock or keyless entry system uses. Most units have a cutoff where if the car isn't started for 3 or 4 days, it will finally do a full shutdown to protect the battery. But for a daily or every other day driver, it is not an issue. Just make sure the wiring is correct. If you swap the constant power and ignition wires, you will either drain your battery overnight or lose your settings every time.
Okay, let's pivot a bit. We have talked about the hardware, but what about the longevity in that heat? Even a good unit is going to be stressed. Are there any physical things Daniel can do to protect the unit? I am thinking about those silver sunshades people put in their windshields.
Sunshades are the unsung heroes of car electronics. I know it sounds basic, but a high-quality reflective sunshade that covers the entire windshield makes a massive difference in the peak temperature of the dashboard. If the sun isn't directly hitting the screen of the head unit, you are saving it from a lot of thermal stress. Also, when he first gets in the car, he should crack the windows and get the air conditioning blasting toward the dash before he starts demanding a lot from the head unit. Give the plastic a chance to cool down before you start the GPS.
It is like a warm-up routine, but for cooling down. I like it. Now, what about the reputable brands on the budget side? We mentioned Teyes and Joying, but those can get a bit pricey. Are there any sleeper brands that are reliable but maybe less flashy?
Makita and Nabifly are often mentioned in the same breath. They are actually often the same hardware as the more expensive brands, just with slightly less polished software and less customer support. If Daniel is comfortable doing a bit of troubleshooting or installing his own launcher, a Makita M600 or M700 is a fantastic value. It uses that UIS chipset, and you can often find it for around $220. Another one to look at is Dasaita. They are a bit more expensive, but their build quality is top tier for this market.
And what about the long-term durability of these things? We are talking about consumer electronics that aren't built to the same standards as, say, a factory head unit from Toyota or Volkswagen. Those factory units are tested for years in extreme conditions.
That is the trade-off. A factory unit is built to survive 20 years of extreme vibrations and temperatures, but it has the computing power of a calculator from 1995. These Android units are essentially tablets stuffed into a car's dashboard. They will probably last 3 to 5 years before something starts to fail, whether it is the screen digitizer or a memory chip. But at $250, most people are okay with that because the technology moves so fast anyway. In 5 years, we will probably be looking at entirely different standards.
That is true. A 2012 factory radio feels like a museum piece now. An Android unit at least gives you modern features like Spotify, Google Maps, and even OBD2 diagnostics. But speaking of the year, it is 2026. Are there any new developments in this space that Daniel should be aware of? Anything that has changed in the last year or two?
We are starting to see more units with integrated 5G modems. If he wants to have a dedicated data plan for the car so he doesn't have to use his phone as a hotspot, that is becoming much more affordable. Also, some units are now coming with built-in dash cam and 360-degree camera support. If he is already tearing the dash apart to install the head unit, it might be worth looking for a unit that supports those features. Adding a rear view camera is a must, but a full 360 system is incredible for parking.
That 360-degree camera setup is a game changer for parking in tight spots in Jerusalem. I might actually need that for our car. It is like having a drone hovering over your car while you park.
It really is. It uses 4 wide-angle cameras around the car and stitches them together into a bird's-eye view. The processing power required for that is exactly why you need that UIS 7870 chip. A cheaper chip would just freeze up trying to render that video in real time. It is a lot of data to process.
So, let's talk about the actual buying process. Daniel mentioned AliExpress. Is that still the best place, or should he look elsewhere? I know some people are nervous about ordering expensive electronics from overseas.
AliExpress is fine if you go through the official stores. Teyes has an official store. Makede has an official store. Do not buy from a random shop called Global Tech number 5423. Stick to the manufacturers. Alternatively, if he wants better return protection, Amazon has many of these brands now, but the markup is usually 20 or 30%. It is essentially a convenience tax. You pay more so you can return it easily if it arrives broken or if it doesn't fit his Ibiza.
It is worth it for the peace of mind, honestly. Especially if you aren't an expert like you, Herman. If I get a box of wires and it doesn't work, I want to be able to send it back without paying $50 in shipping to China.
Exactly. And one more thing for Daniel, check the cooling fan noise reviews. Some of the cheaper units use very high-pitched, whiny fans that you can hear even over the music. If he is an audiophile or just likes a quiet cabin, he might want to spend a little extra on a unit known for having a quiet fan, or be prepared to swap it out for a better one.
That is a great point. You don't want your car to sound like a server room when the radio is on. It kind of ruins the vibe of a nice Sunday drive.
Definitely not. Now, before we wrap up the hardware talk, I want to mention one more thing about the heat. Thermal paste.
Oh boy, here we go. You want Daniel to take the unit apart and rebase the CPU, don't you? I knew this was coming.
I am not saying he has to, but I am saying that the factory application of thermal paste on these units is notoriously bad. It is often just a dry, crusty pad or a huge glob of the cheapest stuff imaginable. If he is feeling adventurous, opening the unit and applying some high-quality thermal paste like Arctic Silver can drop the operating temperature by 10 degrees Celsius. In a climate like Jerusalem, that can be the difference between the unit lasting 2 years or 5 years. It is a 30-minute job that pays huge dividends.
Okay, so that is the pro tip for the enthusiasts. For the rest of us, stick to the specs and the brands. I think we have given Daniel a pretty solid roadmap here. It is about balancing the chip efficiency, the physical cooling, and the software load.
I think so too. It really comes down to not being tempted by the ultra-budget options. That 1 gigabyte of RAM is a siren song that leads to nothing but lag and regret. In 2026, you really want to aim for that 8 gigabyte mark if you want the unit to feel like a modern smartphone.
Lag and regret, the name of my upcoming memoir. But seriously, this is such a common issue. We see people all the time trying to save $50 on tech that they use every single day, and it ends up costing them more in frustration than the $50 was worth. If you're in your car for an hour a day, that is 365 hours a year of being annoyed by your radio.
It is the classic Vimes boot theory of socioeconomic unfairness, but for car stereos. If you buy the cheap one, you have to replace it sooner and you have a worse experience the whole time. Spend the money on a good UIS 7870 unit with a fan, and you will be much happier.
Exactly. Well, I think that covers the bulk of it. Daniel, hopefully that gives you some clarity on your Seat Ibiza upgrade. Look for that UIS 7870, get at least 4, but preferably 8 gigabytes of RAM, and maybe keep a sunshade in the windshield.
And if you do end up doing the install yourself, send us a picture of that cable management. I want to see if you can tame that hornet's nest. Use the Teyes tape, Daniel. It prevents rattles and looks professional.
He probably can't, but we can hope. Before we go, I want to thank everyone for listening. We've been doing this for over 600 episodes now, and it is still just as much fun as the day we started. We love diving into these weirdly specific technical rabbit holes.
It really is. And it is all thanks to the great prompts we get. If you are enjoying the show, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It helps more than you know in getting the word out and helping other people find us. We're trying to save the world from bad car audio, one listener at a time.
Yeah, a quick rating or a couple of sentences really makes a difference. You can find all our past episodes, including some of our deeper dives into thermal physics and car tech, at myweirdprompts.com. We also have an RSS feed there if you want to subscribe directly.
And of course, we are on Spotify. If you have a weird prompt of your own, whether it is about car tech, kitchen appliances, or the physics of a bouncy ball, there is a contact form on the website. We love hearing what you guys are curious about.
Alright, that is it for this episode. I am Corn.
And I am Herman Poppleberry.
Thanks for listening to My Weird Prompts. We will catch you in the next one.
Stay cool out there. Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox Turbo.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify, or visit myweirdprompts.com.